It's my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Digital Liberal Arts Collaboratory launch. Dean Rabbit was unexpectedly unable to be here today, but she sends her greetings and her well wishes for a successful launch. This effort is a product of our strategic planning done by the college, in which we desired to develop new opportunities to enhance faculty scholarship and the student experience. We were pleased that the proposal was supported by the university-level strategic planning grants. We recognize the significant investment by the university and are thankful for the opportunity to bring this to the campus community. I'd like to begin by thanking the task force that helped us with the Digital Liberal Arts Lab. I'd like to recognize Dr. Gammon Bartle, Dr. Megan Chesson, Mr. Jim Miles, Dr. Barbara Zeiss, and I also served on the committee. So we began our efforts really starting with what's the vision? What do we want the vision of our lab, or our lab at the point, and then it became a collaboratory later. And so we crafted this initial vision. And that vision is that the Digital Liberal Arts Lab is a liberal arts-based collaborative laboratory, thus the word collaboratory, that provides space, equipment, support for digital projects in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. As the college works to integrate digital projects into curricula and courses, the lab will be a center for those activities. It is our hope that faculty, students, and staff will use the lab to deepen their collaborations, learn digital skills, and work across disciplines to create new knowledge. So, it was important for us to really create this space, this broader digital space. And so we've been really excited about it. But one of the things we were absolutely committed to was to making sure that this was not going to be a space that collected dust. That was our unofficial motto, is that this is not going to be a place that's going to collect dust. So we are encouraging engagement with the faculty community and engagement with our students. And we are so excited to bring our opening launch with our keynote speaker will be introduced by Dr. Barbara Zeiss.
John Muccigrosso is professor of classics at Drew University, where he's been a member of the department since 1998. He's currently on leave from Drew this year to serve as provost and vice president for academic affairs at Holy Names University in Oakland, California, where he also serves as the professor in charge for the Intercollegiate Center for Classical Studies. He's a recipient of numerous awards and grants, including the Mellon Digital Humanities Grant, for which he served as co-director in 2017-2018, a Drew University Digital Humanities Summer Institute Faculty Grant in 2018, and he also served as the co-principal investigator for the NEH Institute for Advanced Topics in the Digital Humanities, linked Ancient World Data Institute in 2011 and 2013. His academic interests, in addition to digital humanities, include Italian archaeology, Roman history, and Latin pedagogy. He serves on the editorial board of the Bryn Mawr Classical Review. He's the owner of Greek Arc, an email list for Greek archaeology. From 2008 to 2017, he served as the director of the Vicus Martis Tudortium Field School, an archaeological excavation site in Umbria. And there are too many conference presentations and invited talks and reviews and peer-reviewed publications to mention specifically, but interestingly for our purposes here, they include work on linked open data and on developing an online database of Roman temples. He's involved in other digital humanities endeavors that I frankly don't quite understand yet, but that's why many of us are here, to learn more about that. So we're here to learn more about what opportunities await us in the world of digital liberal arts. Welcome, Professor Muccigrosso.
All right, thank you, Barbara. Let's see if we can. There we go. Thanks, everybody, Martina and Gammon, Barbara. Megan, and all you for attending. Can I get some sense of where everybody is or what you do here? So how many people are faculty? Just raise your hands. Okay, how many people are IT or technology related staff or something else? Guys in the back, raise your hands. Okay, definitely left somebody out. Administrators and other. Okay, did I think everyone raise their hand? Is that right? Anybody not get to raise their hand? I don't want you to feel left out. Okay, no. Students? Any students? There we go. Thank you. Okay. All right. So really, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a little stuffy. I have taken the appropriate decongestant, so which are starting to kick in. But I have a box of tissues up front, so please don't be surprised if I end up hitting that pretty often. So I thought I'd start off with kind of a slightly kind of interactive little part here, which is to talk really about the digital humanities. This is one of those images that makes its way around the internet fairly frequently. It is from the turn of the century, the last turn of the century, and it is, as you can see from the French on the top, a little French cartoon, some sort of imagining of what technology would do to education, what education would look like in the year 2000. So here it is. You have the books. These are very common themes which you will recognize, right? The end of books. Books will be put into big bins, and actually when Gammon walked me in this morning, we walked by the bins that the library uses, as they're calling things. So books being put into big bins, churned, mechanically with a little help from the unfortunate student there, and then somehow being transmitted electronically, or electrically, I suppose, in the early 20th century, into the brains of these students who are listening, one imagines, to something. I don't know if it's the words of the text you're supposed to imagine, but they're just sitting at desks, right? They're not looking at each other. They don't have pencils and paper or slate and chalk, whatever would have been appropriate. And as you read things, actually, once again, Gammon this morning forwarded to me a little article. What was it? The End of College. Right, so these are the kinds of things you still read about, right? That we're killing off books, that classroom learning really isn't applicable anymore. So a lot of these themes probably should sound familiar. So I want to start with what is an old joke by kind of digital humanities standards. So this is a tweet by Scott Weingart, who's a fairly techie kind of digital humanist. So you see the joke, knock, knock, who's there? Digital humanities who? Well, that's a great question. Who is and isn't a digital humanist? The answer surely has changed over the last decade, and then you get the slam door in your face. That's because people like me giving talks like this often start off with, what are the digital humanities? So I'm going to do that anyway, despite the slam door, and I'm going to ask you what you think of when someone says digital humanities, or in the case here, the digital liberal arts. Oh, I have a clicker, which I should use. Little technology. There we go. So what is this thing we call the digital liberal arts here? So this is audience participation, and this slideshow is just a web page, so I'll make it available to everybody. So if you click on this link, you go to a site. Let's see if this works. It's always dangerous going live during a talk, but we'll do it anyway. There it goes. Okay, I'll make it a little bit bigger. So every time you go to this page, you will get a new answer. There are 800 and some odd. There it is, 817 answers to this question. So here's a classic digital humanities thing. We'll take a little survey, then we'll make it available to everybody to use freely. So what is it? Area studies focused on the integration of information and communications technologies to research and fields of the arts and humanities, and on the development of computing tools to further that research. So let's see if we're allowed to. There we go. Here's another one. Representing humanities data sets as digital objects that can be manipulated or rendered programmatically. I don't have a definition yet. That's why I'm here. All right. So if you go to this website, it's actually fun. There, again, 817 of them. Over your lunch break, whatever. So that's what these people said. So what do you think? What do people here think of when you think of digital humanities or digital liberal arts? In any way. And so I tried to click through randomly just to get some various different kinds of answers, because if you go through this data set, people answered this in extraordinarily different ways, including I don't know. So, somebody. Yes, Megan.
When we were first invited onto the committee, I was like, oh, mapping software. That was the only thing that came to mind.
Okay.
Kind of data visualization, yeah, just finding ways to make data more interesting and engaging to students.
Okay, so mapping, data visualization, and then making data more interesting for students. Okay, great. Anybody else? There's no wrong answer here, obviously, but yes.
I was thinking of the research. My research is very much helped by what I understand as digital humanities in terms of like the uploading of all these documents from the Victorian era that are available to me, readily available to me via the web in a way that they wouldn't be.
Okay, so utilizing kind of modern internet technology to make resources, scholarly resources, available to a broader audience, often for free.
Yes.
Right? Other people besides the organizers in the front row? I know no one said there would be interaction, but yes.
I'm in the anthropology department, so it's pretty easy for me to see 3D printing of artifacts and early hominin remains and things like that, which Jim just did for me.
I was going to say, I think I saw one of those, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it seems, that application seems pretty
Okay, so kind of creation of 3D, so replicas of artifacts so that you can actually kind of hold the thing in your hand or look at it right there in front of you instead of seeing a picture in a book or online maybe. Okay, one more different kind of thing. Yes?
I guess when I think about digital humanities, I think of public history projects.
Okay, good. So public history projects, and in fact, we'll have one of those up later. Are there any that are of particular interest to you?
Yes, I would like to start one.
Okay, excellent. Very good. Okay, so good. So let's see if I can now go back to my, there we go. Yes, I can. Okay. So that was good. So what I thought I would do here, and I even have notes so I don't lose track. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about a couple of figures, use a couple of scholars to show a little bit of the way in which what we're calling digital humanities or digital liberal arts are really just the kind of a continuation, not even an extension, but a continuation of what people have been doing for a long time. So I'll start with this guy that I ran into in my own research. I was doing a class with students, and we were doing some kind of digital humanities type projects, and I was looking for an article in JSTOR that would be accessible to them along the lines of what we were doing. And I found this article by this gentleman here, George Benjamin Hussey, and you see his lovely, distinguished guy. So it's interesting because he became interesting to me for a number of reasons. First off, he actually turns out to be from South Orange. I was living in Maplewood at the time, so that was a nice little coincidence there. So local boy. And he ended his life in North Carolina, where his family still is, actually. It's not all that common a last name, so I was actually able to track down his descendants with a little bit of internet sleuthing. I'll come back to these two works of his. So what was interesting was, to me, one of the first things besides his work was his career. So he got his bachelor's from Columbia and then his PhD from Johns Hopkins. So he has PhD by 1890. In 1906, he was off in Bonn and Leipzig to study. So this very traditional late 19th, early 20th century, go off to Germany where they do real scholarship to finish off your education. And then he was at the University of Paris for a while. Now, his career was quite interesting, too, when you think about the kind of modern careers that many of us have in academia. So he was a fellow at Johns Hopkins. He was a postgrad fellow at Princeton. He was a docent at Chicago for 3 years. 2 years at Emporia College in Kansas. 4 years at the Pingree School, so came back home. Another 2 years at Allegheny Prep in Pittsburgh. A year at Adrian College in Michigan. A year at Cumberland University in Tennessee. 3 years at Newberry College in South Carolina. Most of that time he was teaching French, Spanish, and German. So, very versatile guy. And then for 14 years, he was at Maryville College, which is in Tennessee, home of the Fighting Scots. Anybody? Maybe Maryland fan? And then finally, he ended up, he finished in North Carolina, as you can see from his life there. So what was interesting to me on the academic side was his work. So you see there are two things I've pulled out here. The first one is a book, a handbook of Latin homonyms, comprising the homonyms of Caesar, Nepos, Sallust, Cicero, Virgil, Horace, Tacitus, and Livy. So words that sound alike, right? And the tricky part is that in Latin, and here's the title page of the book, the lovely Greek inscription, not many things, but much. That was a nice little epigram. So in Latin, there are a number of words that look the same but are totally different. And we have a lot of these in English, like tear and tear. So making a compendium of these so that students could realize that there were some complications. Now, it turns out this is actually kind of a sticky problem in modern computer-based reading of texts. If you're trying to parse words in a text, whether it's for students or just because you're interested in the language, it's a little tricky when you run across a word that is not unambiguous, so an ambiguous form of a word, which happens more in Latin than it does in other languages. Sometimes the context gives it away, but it's a big help if your sort of artificial construct knows that that's possible for those words to be, for that to be different words. So this was him making a list, and making lists of words is a big thing. Does anybody do foreign language work or teach foreign languages? Right? Like vocabulary lists. The 1,000 most common words in X. And if you go to Barnes & Noble or whatever bookstores are still around anymore, there's a section there, and they often seem to be kids' books, but they're very helpful if you're learning a language. The first 1,000 words in Spanish, and it's a picture book often, and the little gato is labeled and so on. So this is the kind of thing that was going on. Often they weren't cute picture books. Actually, sometimes they are. But this is the kind of thing that language people are intensely interested in. Here's a little note about this, and I put this up here because, for a couple of reasons. One, you can see he immediately says, look, I relied on other people's work. Right? I didn't do this by myself. I wrote this particular book, but it was invaluable to me to check these various indexes for these other authors. The second thing was that he says quite clearly that there are going to be mistakes in it, and you probably can't ever get rid of mistakes. Right? All he wants is that it's not any worse than these other books, which is, probably a little bit of modesty, false or otherwise, but also a recognition that we make mistakes and it's hard to get them. So notice that there's no sense that he'll be able to go back and fix the errors. People do second editions and third editions, right? That happens with books. This one didn't happen with, but you do get a chance to fix errors. But he kind of assumes that everybody's got mistakes and that there is no sort of iterative process that leads to these things getting better. Again, as I say, that's not quite true. We all know that there are multiple editions of works, but it is interesting that this is the kind of apology he makes at the beginning. The second work, and here I'm showing you the JPEG cover page because it's all words. All right? It is all text, this article. There's not even a table in it. And the title it's a little hard to see, The Distribution of Hellenic Temples. So 1890. He spent a lot of time creating a list of all Greek, Hellenic in the older English style, Greek temples from the ancient world that were known at the time. Very useful thing to have. He doesn't publish the list. He publishes the results of what he observed. So what did he do? He went and found, all the various temples to Zeus and Apollo and Poseidon and so on and so forth. And then he talks about the frequency of them. Well, temples to Zeus are the most common kind, and temples to Apollo are fairly common, and on and on. But he describes it. He doesn't give the data. He doesn't provide a table. He doesn't provide a nice map. Somebody mentioned doing maps of things. He doesn't do any of that. It's entirely possible for him to have done it. People in the 1890s made maps. But he doesn't. So it was interesting to me that he chose, and it was accepted for publication in a fairly prominent, the American Journal of Archaeology is it's the flagship publication of the Archaeological Institutes of America, which is the major classical world archaeological organization in the country and Canada. So it was published in a fairly reputable journal, and very reputable journal, and yet it's all text without any of those aids. The reason, this is what got me started on him, because this is this is related to my project that I'll talk about by the end of mapping and creating database of temples. I was hoping his notes would be around someplace. And that's how I found out about his career hopping from place to place, which again, I couldn't help but be reminded of kind of modern academic careers and the way contingent positions are so current these days. I don't know if he had an issue. There's a reason he had to hop around. He was just unlucky. But I did eventually track down somebody in his family, and they were very nice, and they said, no, we don't have any archives. And I tried to track down the various schools, and no one else had any archives either. I found out some interesting stuff from some of them, but he hadn't left any papers. So I was a little disappointed professionally, because I was hoping that I could use some of his work. So he's the first one, and I'm going to come back to a couple of themes that this raises. The second is actually another New Jersey connection, so I'll let you read a little bit from Boswell's life of Johnson. So there are a couple things there. First, you'll see that I stole this not from, I gave you the secondary source that I used, which was Paul Diederich, and a book that he wrote, Measuring Growth in English. So it's English language ability and growth in English language. Okay, so that makes you think maybe of ESL or something like that, but notice he's measuring growth in it, which is why this quote is so relevant. So it's a little comical. When you hear the big number, wow, that's a lot, right? 1,000 people ate at his house in a year. And then Johnson immediately does the math and says, well, that's 3 a day, right? And so Boswell says, well, that doesn't sound so impressive. Well, that's the good of counting, right? So here, the kind of connection, the obvious connection with digital humanities, although Diederich wouldn't have called this. So here's a quickie version of Paul Diederich's career. He taught high school. Again, I have the clicker, which I'm not used to. And then he did a thesis in the late 30s at Chicago, The Frequency of Latin Words and Their Ending, which is how I first learned about him. And I'll describe that process in a second. And then in 1949, he joined the ETS. So there's our New Jersey connection, the Educational Testing Service. So as sort of the heyday of modern testing, especially things like the SAT, is gearing up, he's right there for this, and he's one of the very important people in it, it turns out. And then later on, he goes back and teaches high school. He's got a great quote about teaching high school. Early in my career, I decided I was not good enough to teach in elementary schools, and I was just about to give up teaching in secondary schools, but I would be damned if I would lower myself to teach in a college. I receded from that lofty position when I accepted employment at the University of Chicago, but I never felt quite at home there. Now I am back where I belong in secondary schools, the Lord's vineyard. So you can take that as you will. There's a room full of college faculty. So what was interesting about Diederich's work for me, this is part of my work in Latin pedagogy. And I have to say, I did this, I guess, in the late 90s, early 2000s. So early internet days. But it wasn't really a time yet when people were sharing a lot of their work online, and it wasn't necessarily very easy to do that. So I did a lot of work sitting at a computer and entering a lot of data. And I published an article, but that was it. It just sat as an article in print somewhere until, I don't know, 10 or so years later, people really started applying more computational techniques to the study of languages, in Latin in particular. And so this group, to my surprise, really liked the article, and and they were doing much more advanced things than I was with it. So the idea is this: what he discovered was that in teaching students Latin, if his students could recognize 85% of the words in a text, they could read it fairly comfortably. There's a lot of research about what it takes to have students read, or anybody read a foreign language. At which point do you feel like, okay, I'm actually reading this? So he figured 85%, they recognize the stems of a bunch of the other words. So they might not have known the word, but they could figure it out because it looked like another word that they knew. And then the rest of them they didn't know, but they could look them up, and it was infrequent enough that they were okay doing the reading. And again, a lot of people have done a lot of work on this, so that this work has been replicated with a lot of languages, and it's very common now. So how does he do? So in the 1940s, when he's doing this, how do you figure out what are frequent words in a foreign language. You have to count them. And there are, Barbara has these nice texts that are available now. Nothing's available digitally, right? There's no such thing really. There are computers, but no one's got them. So how did he do it? He took 3 standard Latin readers, and he mimeographed them onto different colored paper. So one was prose, one was poetry, one was medieval texts. Mimeographed them, took out a nice sharp pair of scissors, and cut up every page into individual words. Now, if you think back to, we know from Hussey's book, some of those words look like other words. So before he did that, he had to go through all of these hundreds and hundreds of pages of Latin text, and wherever there was an ambiguous word, he'd have to say which word it was. So he would write a little note above it. Because once they were cut into little pieces, there's no context, you couldn't tell anymore. And he says, I missed a few. I realized after I cut them up that, oh, that was an ambiguous word. So if he had Hussey's book, it might have helped him. But so then he had these piles of words, and he sorted them all into the various different words, and then he counted them. And then he made a nice table like this. So if you do any of this work, it's sort of the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, right? 20% of a set gives you 80% of the results. So in this case, you can see the number of words goes along the bottom, and along the x-axis, and then what percent of the text you're going to get coverage from those words goes along the vertical axis. So he's got A and B there. So there's his, roughly, A is at his 85%, roughly, not quite. So if students know a little over 1,000 words in Latin, that's his magic 85%. That means they can read comfortably. And so my article is actually about looking at various Latin textbooks and seeing how many of these really important words they covered. And it turns out not a lot, often. Even though Diederik wasn't the only person to do this by far, there are all sorts of books with lists. The most common words in Virgil, right? The most common words in Cicero, how to read Horace. So this was a common thing that was being done, but you see, it's very difficult. In 1949, to do this work is really challenging. Another thing he produced was his top 300 words, which would get you something like 50%. If we go, in fact, let's see if this works. If you go back, if you see where 50% is, there's a little shooter here. So there's 50%, right? So you're right about 500, 400, 300. You're somewhere around 200 to 300 words get you 50%. So that's pretty good. That's a pretty good return on your investment if you learn those words early. So here's his list of all the words. Latin, any Latinists? Anybody took Latin? Remember Latin? Vaguely. So que is a enclitic. It's stuck on another word, means and. Not surprisingly, it's the most common word in Latin. Oops, sorry about that. Et is the number 3 word, just so you see. So those words both mean and. So unsurprisingly, they're very, very common words. So again, this work was done in the middle of the 20th century, and then it's like textbook writers completely either ignored it or forgot about it. It was a very big focus in the early 20th century. Then it ceased to be of any concern to anybody, it seemed like. There were a few exceptions, but for the most part, that didn't happen. Now, it turns out these days, one of the things you can do, I have on my computer, and it would fit on my phone easily, basically all of classical Latin. You can run a program that will generate this list in, 3 seconds. So when you think about sitting down with pink-colored paper and cutting things up, we've come a long way, as long as you're thinking about applying these techniques. All right, again, just to emphasize that my sort of idea that people have been doing this forever, breaking down language, at least looking for commonalities. This is a Greek to Latin vocabulary list for Cicero's Catilinarians, and if you took Latin, you may have read, how long will you abuse our patience, O Catiline? Is one of the beginning of the Catilinarians. So here's the Latin text. You can see something like in exilium there. If you can make that out. And this is a Greek translation on the right. So it's a bilingual text. So for the Greek student who's trying to learn Latin, they have little vocabulary notes. So this is the kind of thing people are doing all the time. With digital techniques, if you can figure out which word it is, for somebody else, the computer to look it up is a trivial thing. So there's a lot of that going on now, and a lot of these works, even though they were very kind of manually compiled and very tediously compiled, they turn out still to be useful for us. So again, this to emphasize that this kind of work has been going on. So the digital part of it's new, sure, but not the driving kind of philosophy behind it. All right, so just to talk a little bit about what are not necessarily techniques like mapping in particular or public history projects, but just some of the kind of philosophical underpinnings of the modern digital humanities, digital liberal arts community that you'll see if you go out there. And these I think are very relevant to us today as scholars trying to figure out what we're doing. So the first one is sharing. Okay, this is very much like things I learned in kindergarten. Sharing. And so the attitude that we're posing here is this, right? I've stolen this from Eric Kanza, who runs a big database project for the humanities out in Berkeley. That this is my data, and it's mine, and you can't have it, right? And that is a very traditional model in scholarship. I collected the data, I put it into nice tables, I cleaned it up, right? It belongs to me, and you can't see it, you can't use it, and I will publish it probably at some point. And when I die, my family retains the rights to my data. And this happens in archaeology, actually, this happened fairly frequently, that somebody would excavate a site, they'd have all the information, they'd have the notebooks. Sometimes they'd have the objects, and then they would die, as people do, and hadn't been published yet. Okay, so what happens to that information? Well, oftentimes families would jealously guard them. Maybe there'd be a favorite student, right, or a colleague, but often they would be, too often they would be held on to. So sharing your data rather than holding on to it, putting it out there. So part of that involves trusting that your colleagues aren't going to come in and simply grab your data and not give you any credit for it. Now the fact that you've published it or put it out publicly, so publish, right, is to make public. So the fact that you've published it in some form means that's a little harder to do. I think we also tend to kind of, as scholars, be a little paranoid and think, oh, someone will come in and scoop me and take my data, as if the editorial board wouldn't notice, right? Or that somebody else later wouldn't be able to say, you know, you just took that, didn't you? And you didn't give them credit. So sharing the data, putting it out there right away is one thing that you'll find a lot of people advocating for. So questioning and challenging, depending on how optimistic or positive you like to be about this practice. That is to say, why do we do the things that we do? Why does the world work this way? It doesn't have to. So the idea here is, look, there's all this technology. I don't have to sit there with a pair of scissors and cut up a mimeographed copy of a textbook. I can do it differently. What are the implications of me being able to do it differently? What does that mean about the way we've traditionally done scholarship and the way we've granted credit, for example? So what I've got here is publishing models. So if I click on this, there we go. So just to give you, this is my blog, which is, you can see from the dates. I've been a little lackadaisical about this lately, but so what's the status of a blog? So academics, what do you think the status of a blog is if somebody says to you, hey, I wrote a blog post about that? What's your reaction to that? As opposed to saying, oh, I wrote this article about that. It's in the Journal of, Advanced Basket Weaving last year, number 2. What's your response when you hear somebody say blog versus article? Yeah. Okay, so that the peer review element of it. Okay, some nodding going on. Anybody else?
It's not worth much.
It's not worth much. Okay, and where does that come from? Where's the value?
What matters to move ahead in academia.
Okay, all right. So it's not. So if you go to your tenure committee, hey, I wrote this great blog post, 4,000 people. I got retweeted, and right, it's all over Facebook. So what? What might be the attitude of the R&T committee? Anyone ever cited a blog post? Much less cited a tweet? Well, there are people who will say, oh, you should put your work. So people who are bloggers, you may know Sarah Bonds. She's a classicist in Iowa right now. She wrote for Forbes. She now, who's she writing for now? I'm blanking. She moved to write for somebody else. You may have heard about her because she did a lot of work she published an article in Forbes, so this is not a scholarly article, right? Published an article in Forbes talking about whiteness in ancient statuary. The ancient Greek and Roman statues weren't white. They're white now because the paint has all faded away. And there's a connection between seeing ancient art as white and pure and, not, shocker, modern kind of racist takes on the past. So she wrote about this, got death threats and so on, lots of very nasty responses from the internet. I know you'll be shocked. Nastiness online. But she will argue very vehemently. Someone will say, oh, that was a great blog post. Why don't you publish an article about that? She says, well, I published a blog post about that. You can read that. You can cite it. It has a citation. It's easy to do. So this question of what's the value of peer review exactly? And if you've been following whether you like it or not, there was very recently a group of people who sort of scammed a whole bunch of journals and got them to publish articles that were not completely, but sort of faked, right? They didn't have real data. And again, however you feel about that and their politics in particular, certainly calls into question the problem with peer review. Nature also, a month or so ago, had to retract a whole slew of articles. So there's the gold standard, at least on the other side of the Atlantic, for scientific publishing. And there are clearly problems with peer review. So a lot of people who were arguing that, blog posts are okay, would point to that and say, yeah, there isn't peer review, but it's not like nothing's happening there. It's not like there's no value to those, and it's not like peer review actually works all the time. So that is another kind of attitude. You'll see this sort of, why do we do it this way? Now, the other side of academic publishing, of course, that's much debated these days is where the money goes, right? How the labor gets used. So Elsevier, which now I don't know what fraction of publishing certainly in the academic side, they control a huge percentage of academic publishing. They make profits like nobody else. ExxonMobil would love to have the profits that Elsevier does. I don't know if that's quite true, but they're very, very, very profitable. It is easy. Just do your favorite internet search engine, Elsevier profits. Incredible amounts of money. So how do they make that money? Partly they make that money. Now, obviously, they do the hard work of publishing and getting the things out there. But how does that happen? So anybody peer-reviewed an article lately? Anybody done peer review? How much did you make for that peer review? 0. Anybody else? You get paid for your peer review? Right. Anybody write an article, have an article published recently? How much did you get paid for the article? Nothing. Very good. And I think we all know if you want to make money in academic publishing, like if that happens, you do a textbook that's very popular, like Intro to very large intro course, right? Your books don't make you money. And yet they make Elsevier a ton of money. So one of the issues that a lot of people in digital humanities will bring up is, what kind of a system is this that relies on the unpaid labor of not only established scholars, people with tenured positions, but also sometimes graduate students or junior faculty who feel like their tenure committees won't do anything for them if they're not doing this kind of activity. So we're in this system that hands over enormous profits to private corporations at the expense of us, basically, people in this room. Right? So that's the kind of thing that you'll often see people saying. And again, that connects with the sharing. I can share things with you. I don't need private company X to help me share my data with you. I'll look at some of the ways you can do it. I can do this for free, basically. I don't need you anymore. So given that, how do we reframe the discussion or the conversation or the tenure process to acknowledge that and to maybe create a more fair system? So you'll see a lot of that as well. So this leads to what, the open movement, whether it's open access, right? Open publishing, open review. Has anyone published anything in an open access venue? And there are different versions of open access. Generally, in some form, it means people can get your work without paying for it. But there's a kind of a range to that. But has anybody published in what is explicitly an open access journal? Gammon has. Nobody else? Has anybody intentionally avoided publishing in an open access journal? Megan has, okay. Right, maybe some other people. But so that is, why?
Does it cost money?
Okay, because you had to pay. So that's one model where the author pays so that other people don't have to pay. Which is, some would argue that's making explicit what's actually being hidden behind Elsevier, right? Because we've all had the JSTOR thing, right, where you forget to log in to Easy Proxy or whatever you're using, and the article pops up, and you go, oh yeah, that's how much is that? $40 for that 10-page article, right? So in order to avoid that, one version has it paid up front. Anybody else avoided? No one else really has avoided publishing an open access journal?
They also have a reputation that they're not as prestigious.
Okay, so prestige, one of those things about prestige, right? Okay, yes?
I was given the choice, and I chose not to do it open access for that very reason, because it would cost me several $100s, I think.
Right. Okay, so you would have done it. So several hundred dollars is maybe, if you're on JSTOR, I don't know, 5 downloads, maybe 10 downloads of that article. I mean, you're not getting that much. They're not cutting you in on that, right? So yeah, you'll see a lot of people in the digital humanities arguing for open access, and in fact, trying to make journals with the same rigid standards. We have peer review, right? We have a process that works the same way. It's just that at the end, everybody can get those. So you have this kind of battle. Why do we choose the venues that we do? And this is an active discussion among a lot of people. There's also open reviewing. Is anybody familiar with this? That's where you're not anonymous when you do a review. And so the review, instead of being, there's a Twitter feed for second reviewer, which is snarky and has all those kind of comments you often see in the other, in some reviews. But the argument here is, this is a community of scholars. Let's act like a community and talk to each other and be open and kind of face-to-face with each other about it. Don't be snarky, be serious, and then we can improve our work. So some people will even publish, and the sciences do this. Anybody, science people? Anybody? I realize this is not digital liberal arts collaboratory, but in the sciences, doing preprints is very common. You put your work out there early, and you get feedback, and it's not private feedback. I'm sure some of it's private, but it can be public, and people respond to that. All right, so let's talk, just to kind of go through this. So when we talk about free, there's free as in beer, right? That is, you don't pay for it. That's the kind of thing we mostly think of. There's free as in speech, right? Kind of a more philosophical idea that you're free to say what you want. And then there's Megan's kind of thing, free as in kittens. So lots of people will give you kittens for free. It is not free to own. My wife's a cat person. I've done this. It is not free to own cats. They cost you. So, that kind of idea. Is this free? Well, free to whom is the question that gets brought up when you talk this. The last concept in this is this idea of sharing, and not only sharing your data, but connecting it to other people's data. And it's the internet in part that makes this possible. Here's a rather famous, in certain circles, way to think about linked data. And it's from Tim Berners-Lee, who's literally the guy who invented the web. I think he's Sir Tim these days. And so there are several stages to this. And so with this, I not only want to expand on the idea of openness and sharing, but also kind of with your idea of I want to do a project, realizing that you don't have to, you don't have to go to 11 right away. You can start at 1 and work your way up. So Berners-Lee concept of data gives you stars. So there's, it's positive. Again, I mentioned this can be like things I learned in kindergarten. So you get 1 star if your project puts its data out on the web. However you do it. It could be pictures. It could be an Excel spreadsheet. It could be text. Whatever it is, you are sharing your data, so it's on the web. So what does that mean it's on the web? I can go there with my browser, and I can download it. That's what it means. And it's the web. Okay, it's not at some weird anybody use FTP? Remember Gopher? It's not hidden somewhere obscurely. I can go get it with my browser. I'm in Chrome or Firefox or Safari, and I go get it. Number 2, you get another star if that data, if those data are machine readable. That is, here's a picture of my spreadsheet. And you will see these, right? I know some of you use PDFs, and the PDFs are just pictures of pages. Okay, that's useful, but when you go to copy paste, the whole page turns purple or whatever, and then you're like, oh, great. So you get another star if you don't do that, but if you actually make it so that I can copy and paste, kind of, if you think of it that way. 3rd star, you didn't use Excel because people have to pay to get Excel. Right? You used an open, proprietary format. Comma-separated values is an alternative to Excel. But maybe it's a text file, and you, instead of using Word when you're writing a memo, you just have the text file. It's just text. It doesn't take anything to read it. You don't have to pay for it. It's not hidden. It's not some obscure format. Anybody got WordPerfect files? WordPerfect users from back in the day? Right? Try to open those lately? Right? So the idea, part of the idea is this is not going to go obsolete. I'm going to be able to read these files in 10 years or 30 or 200. 4 stars, I'm going to have to shrink my text. 4 stars if you use, now it's starting to get a little techie, you're using standards that are available. Again, open standards so everybody knows what they are. RDF and Sparkle, don't worry about those if you don't know what they are. But they're standards that people agree on. They're not something you just made up. And the last one, you get 5 stars, which is as high as the scale goes, if you do all those things and then you link your data to other people's data sets. So how would that be? Let's say you're doing a project on Irish literature. And it turns out a lot of politicians crop up in this for whatever reason. People talk about politicians when they write. That's not your thing. You don't do politicians. But you've created a database that gives, let's say, late 19th century Irish texts. And you have all sorts of interesting comments, who the author is, when they were written, the genre, where they appeared, et cetera, et cetera. And these politicians occur. Well, you don't know anything about politicians, but somebody reading that might say, wow, well, who is this guy? Maybe somebody else has a lovely Irish politician database online. You don't have to reproduce their work. And the traditional way would be you would put a footnote, right? Please see Seamus O'Haney's wonderful book on Irish politicians of the late 19th century. Or if Seamus's database is online, you could actually link to it so that somebody reading your text might click on a politician's name and be taken over to that other database. Or maybe you just sucked in the data from his, and so that they would see that information. So that's the idea behind linking. So you link it and it's open so that people can get it. All right, so just some kind of concepts. The NEH grant that Barbara was nice enough to mention that I was involved in was creating linked open data for the ancient world. Linked Ancient World Data Institute. So that's Laudy, hashtag Laudy. If you search for hashtag Laudy, if you're into that, you obviously will find other things. Sounds like another word, and so. But if you want to learn more about what we did, that's out there. But this was the same idea. Let's get a whole bunch of people doing different projects, not to work directly together, but to create links, the ability for other people to use their data without having to worry about it. All right, so just to kind of talk about some kinds of digital projects that are out there and approaches to things. And again, so keep in mind now, this is the kind of thing, or these are the kinds of questions that people have been asking for centuries. The kinds of tasks we wanted to do. So it's been going on for a while. Now we're applying digital techniques to them. This will get to the discussion where people say, I don't do digital humanities, I do the humanities. I happen to use digital approaches, right? I'm a humanist, I'm a classicist. I don't say I'm a digital classicist, I just say I'm a classicist. So whether digital will stick around for a long time, it's like acoustic guitar, those retronyms where you have to make up a new term for something. It may just disappear because this is just the way where people work. That idea, sharing your data, working with other people, maybe not directly, but having things out there, thinking about how you're sharing. Here are the kinds of things, some kinds of things that people do. So this is, as if you look at the names, you may notice that they're all Italian. So this is a 15th century Florentine marriages database, which is you can find on Wikipedia. So it's really, making a plot like this is, at the most basic level is really very simple. So what do? If a family is married to another family, you draw a line between the two circles, and each family is a circle. Now, this is not something I do. You can get very mathematical with this. There's whole network theory in math, so I'm not going to pretend to touch that. But even being ignorant, you might just look at this chart, and if I said to you, what was an important Florentine family in the 15th century based on these data? So if you can read them, anybody, you could probably just name the one 15th century Florentine family that you know, and you'll get this question right. Anybody who can read it want to say? Or Tina? The Medici family, look, why? Why did you say that, besides that you know them?
There were many more connections than the others.
Exactly. So they are we say well connected, right? So it's the same idea. So you can use this to explore families. Now, some of the results might not be all that surprising. Everyone knew the Medicis, so it's not surprising that they intermarried. But it does tell you something about what's going on. And you can also see some of these families that might be on the periphery, literally, and the Porpucci, I don't know what their problem was, but no intermarriages at all. So that's one of the techniques. You'll see a lot of network analysis. These lead to these crazy, sometimes you see these outrageous images with lots of circles and lots of lines, and they're completely incomprehensible. And they kind of are. It really is. There's an interesting debate going on now about why we even bother to make those like bowl of spaghetti drawings. That's the pejorative term for them. But this kind of analysis is very popular. And sometimes you can find things in your data that you didn't realize were there, or you can visualize your data so that it's easy to say, oh, that's why. That's what's going on. This is a diagram showing a lot of things. So this gets us into our literary friends here. Ted Underwood is a very well-known and prolific digital humanist, works in literary studies. So this is a nice diagram. So on the outside, you have the kind of general areas of research, let's say. And on the inside, you have very different kinds of tasks that are going on there. So starting in the middle, you can visualize text. So this is kind of what Barbara was talking about. You can just have texts that you can read online. You can start to get a little bit more interesting. You can measure features of the text. So what might that be? How many words are there per chapter? Which sounds like it wouldn't really be that interesting, but it turns out that it often is interesting. How long, then you can go identify distinctive words. How long are words? Turns out that one of the very common ways to tell authors from one another is average length of word. Which you wouldn't think would really be all that helpful. It turns out that it is. So it's this kind of, so you think about Diederik with his scissors cutting up the words on a page, or Hussey identifying homonyms. This kind of work is very easy, and so you can set the computer to be more and more, what would be labor intensive, but now is just computationally intensive. And again, frankly, your phone can do ridiculous things. It's hard to type on it, but otherwise, we all have the computing technology that we need for these very complicated things these days. You can organize works. Why is it, so what does it mean to say, keep picking on the Irish literature since you're here. What does it mean to say that, what is romantic literature, and how close is, the Irish version of that to the English version of that? How would you define that? Well, people will say, that's a romantic work, sure. Not everyone's going to agree on the definition. So what happens if you, let your computer loose on those texts to say, I think all these things are similar. Show me other things that are similar to them. And if you've been following the news, there's a lot of stuff on AI, right, using artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is, you get into tricky territory. You have to be careful about what things you tell the computer, right? These are all romantic texts. And so it'll find things that look like that. And sometimes it picks things that make them similar that you might not have expected. And that's OK if you're dealing with literary text. When you're dealing with people who may or may not be, say, criminals, it gets a little trickier. And so on. So you see kind of the range of things that are going on with linguistics, corpus linguistics, computer science. So people from different fields working together. That is another thing about the digital humanities, I'll have to say. It makes it very easy to kind of talk to your colleagues in other areas, often. Here's a very famous example of the stylometrics, the Trump tweets. I don't know if anybody saw this. Turns out during the campaign, there were two phones that were tweeting in the Donald Trump account. One was an Android, one was an iPhone, and Twitter tells you which is which. So a couple of people did some interesting analyses to demonstrate pretty clearly that Donald Trump wasn't doing all the tweeting, and they used stylometrics. So you can again, your favorite search engine will find this, but I have it linked in the article. Here's another very common thing. So this, maybe Megan gets to yours, just the visualization of data. Right? It's one thing to look at a table, It's another to be able to read the table well, and sometimes it's actually very hard to tell some of the subtleties. So here's a really interesting project, the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, visually showing by the width of the bars where slaves were acquired and where they ended up. Very easy to get a quick overall view of what's going on. Obviously, you want to really get into the details and delve in. This is not a great format for you, but the kind of visualization of data often is very revealing. And certainly, if you're thinking about teaching students, some people are going to remember the picture, right? So these kinds of things can be very helpful. All right, so if you're thinking about being as a scholar in this brave new world of digital humanities, digital liberal arts, what are the kinds of things you can do? And I've mentioned a lot of them, but just to go through things a little bit more concretely. And again, here I would really keep in mind this idea, you don't have to get 5 stars from Sir Tim. Okay, you can get 1 star, that's good. And maybe later on you'll get 2 and 3 and so on. So outside of linked open data, I like to think about it that way. Okay, I can't do this 100%, but I can do 30% of this, I'm pretty sure. And I can get a grant, where Tina will give me some money so that I can get up to 40%. So think about the little that I can do. And again, I would go back to that, let's rethink this. I don't have to be perfect. And again, as scholars, we think, oh, that's not ready for an article. That's just, I don't quite have enough, or I don't have enough chapters for a book. So what? And again, I'm a tenured professor. That's easier for me to say, I realize. But for those of you in the room who are tenured, maybe we can work on that culture, right? So here's one very simple thing. Do you have an online, how many people are on Facebook? Oh, not everybody. Good. I shouldn't. I have a dead account on Facebook. Okay, how many people are on LinkedIn? Okay, that's about the same. How many people are on academia? Just one. Anybody, let's see, what did I miss? Twitter? Okay, sort of. You either are or you aren't. This is, it's like, yeah. Instagram, the kids today. Oh, that's more people on Instagram than on Twitter. All right. That's a thing. Anything else? Did I miss anything, professional or non, where you have an online identity, not just I'm online doing stuff? Snapchat. Snapchat? Really on Snapchat? Wow, that's impressive. Yeah, right. Everybody said that. My kids did it. So there are lots of places to have online identities. Have one. LinkedIn is one. I mean, that's not really academic. A lot of people argue with you about academia.edu. Again, if you're interested, just search for these debates about that. There are other places. You can, let's see if I put it up here. ORCID. ORCID will give you, so I'm not even going to pretend to remember what the acronym is. The ID part is obvious. So let's go there. So ORCID. ORCID provides, it's a little hard to read, ORCID provides a persistent digital identifier. So there's the part of it that distinguishes you from every other researcher and, through integration in key research workflows, supports automatic linkages between you and your professional activities, ensuring that your work is recognized. Okay, notice the linkages, the linked bit. So ORCID, you can go online. You go online to ORCID, it's free. You sign up, they give you an identifier. Various granting agencies will say, oh, do you have an ORCID ID? And then it gets put in there. So now they can attach to your ORCID, online ORCID identity, and you can attach various other things. You could put your CV up there. Okay, it's not a personal web page, but it's a way for you to have an identifier, like your own little ID number, that you can use in various scholarly ways. Now these things work because other people buy in, right? It's the linking. It's like the internet. The really powerful thing about the internet is the way it links things together. So back to the linked open data thing. You're linking yourself to your work in this case and maybe to a scholarly community. But you can go get an ORCID ID. They're free. You don't want to use it, you don't use it. But once you have one, then you can start to identify your work, you with your work. So there are other places to do it, but ORCID is a very common one. So share your work is another one, right? This is not surprising. I already mentioned the whole sharing thing. So what is, in this case, I mean, put your work up online for people to get. Again, you can do this with academia. Your publisher may not be thrilled with how you do that. A lot of publishers have basically exclusivity deals, right? You publish, they will sell it. You can't give it away, they must sell it. Now that's changing. Right? There are a lot of people saying government dollars are paying for that research. Why? So PAC's dollars have paid for the research. Why are we handing it over to a private corporation so they can make money off the tax dollars? That doesn't make any sense as a model. All right? I didn't mention that before, but that's another element. So where can you share your work besides on the website of the journal or on JSTOR? So Zenodo is one. I know all these names, like why did you do that? But so Zenodo is a place where you can put up your work. So you see here, when you go to the homepage, it just gives you recent uploads. And if you look, a lot of them tend to be kind of sciencey, all right? Again, the scientists are way ahead of the humanists on sharing their work. In physics, pretty much everybody publishes pre-publication. They pre-publish, so to speak. It's a horrible term. But. So gene ontology data archive. So there's some data, all right? Then something about breakwater climate change events. Don't really understand that. Polynesian segmented data. That's linguistic data. Okay, notice these are all data. Okay, here's an article. Here's another one, a data set. So lots of data gets published on Zenodo. Using GitHub, we'll talk about that in a second, but you can log in with your GitHub account. So here's Zenodo linking to your GitHub work. We'll talk about GitHub in a sec, but so this is a place for you to put up. Again, you could just put up your data. So you're developing a public history project. You have lots of data. I'm making a beautiful website, and I'd love you to go look at my website. But in the meanwhile, you want the data, go get it. It's up at Zenodo. When you publish it, please say that it was my data. Okay? That's, so again, not necessarily the traditional, I keep forgetting I have a clicker, the traditional model, but one that's going on now. Oh, I have to go back. That's why I went up here. Okay, Zenodo, GitHub. So what is GitHub? I know it's a weird name. All right, so I put the wrong link. This is what happens. But my computer will remember. You can see my search history, always dangerous. All right, so what's GitHub? GitHub is a website now owned by Microsoft, so there's a little discussion when that happened, by the guy Linus Torvalds, who invented Linux, which is a version of Unix, which is an operating system for computers. He needed a way to track changes to his software and let other people collaborate. So it's like if you're a scholar who works within text, which probably most people here do, you have a collaborator. How do you, like, you made changes and they made changes. We've all tried to do that, right? Where you're passing around Word documents and you get final version, and then final version 0.1, and then new final version, and then final version, and then final version after review. It's a nightmare. So what GitHub was designed to do was to keep track of computer code, which is just text, so that you could see changes and you could say, oh, gammon, that was great. I accept those changes. And if you've done track changes in Word, it's much more complicated and much more competent, frankly, at doing it. But it's the same sort of idea. Or no, I don't like those, and I reject the change. So you can put all sorts of things up here. So I've got a whole bunch of these. So we'll get to this later. So here's all the data for my Temples project. And I'll just show you one that's pretty easy to understand what it is. And this slides over so you realize. So this is a big spreadsheet, right? Except it's not a spreadsheet, it's text, comma-separated text. But you can see it's got an ID number, it's got a name, and so on and so forth. So this is an official repository of my project. Anybody can go get this data. I actually took a lot of it from somebody else, to whom I gave credit. So GitHub is a place, a repository to store your projects. If you want, you can use it to keep track of changes to them. Right? If you don't want to, you can just keep them up there. But as you put in new revisions, GitHub is a good place to do that. So people have, again, started writing. People write on it. People keep databases on it. And Zenodo will very happily say, oh, here's a database. It's on GitHub. But Zenodo will provide a kind of central place for you to display that. So that's another one. And again, you don't have to do it all at once. It's a little intimidating. There's GitHub for Dummies. Just go. I mean, the beautiful thing about the internet now is you can go, if you just type in a question, You will, almost definitely, if you're in this sort of digital world, somebody has asked that question before. You may not understand the answer, which is a different kind of problem, but you can find that somebody's tried to answer it. Things are easy to get started on. Getting expert, that's a different story. But knowing enough to be dangerous, we can all do that, right? And as academics, we're very comfortable, saying things about things we know a little about. So, so have an identity, then get your work up there, and then talk to other people. Be part of a community, an online community. And sometimes those online communities are completely online in the sense that you've never met these people, you have no idea what they do, right? On the internet, nobody knows your dog. Everybody know that one? So you can do that. So what are some of the communities? Twitter, seriously. There's an enormous classical archaeology community on Twitter that I belong to, meaning that I follow people, they follow me. Discoveries are announced, articles are announced, interesting finds, discussions happen. People do, Twitter storians. There are people who publish, basically, their work on Twitter. Not the full-length version of it, but enough to get an interest, enough to show other people what you're working on. You can ask questions. Hey, I'm in GitHub, and I can't figure this out, and I don't understand the answer I found. Somebody will help you, probably. All right? So that's one kind of community. We're all used to, well, maybe not, most people in this room have been on Facebook and Instagram and those things. You're parts of communities there. Just think about that in the scholarly way. And they can overlap. But there's a lot of very interesting stuff going on in your area on Twitter, I guarantee you. But it doesn't have to be Twitter. Your professional community might have an email. Anybody belong to those email lists? That's kind of quaint now, right? Those. In the early 2000s, we did that. That was my Greek arc project that Barbara mentioned at the beginning, was having an Greek archaeologist community that people used to post to and respond, and they had little conversations. Nobody does that. Now I announce conferences on it. But the world has changed. People have those conversations elsewhere. So public scholarship, again, this idea that we don't have, everything we do doesn't have to be an article. Okay, and you can you can get your scholarship out there to the public. What did I link to? So clearly I typed that one wrong too. But you can think about blogging. I mentioned Sarah Bond before, who does a lot of work. Get your stuff out there. You don't have to, is there a public version of your scholarly paper? Can you write up a single page? You have this really interesting find. No one reads our articles, like relatively speaking, right? Sarah Bond has tens of thousands of followers on Twitter. So when there's a new discovery and she posts about it, or when she writes about whiteness in archaic statuary, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, read it. Some of those people are jerks. Some of them are not. But it becomes part of the public discourse. And there was an article about a month or two ago in the Atlantic or the New Yorker about the same topic. Sarah's cited in it, but it's clear that what she had done and the kind of furor that arose from that generated that. So by being out in the public, you can actually affect the discourse in ways that you can't. And again, the digital humanities community tends to value that. So other kinds of public scholarship. Contribute to ongoing projects. So Wikipedia has these edit-a-thons. I hate the thon thing, but so what does that mean? And some of you may have heard these. Again, classes are pretty tech savvy. It might be surprising, but we do pretty well. You may be in a field where, say, women are particularly poorly represented on Wikipedia. That just means you're in a field, because women are poorly represented on Wikipedia everywhere. So there may even be an existing project, but you get a bunch of people together. You find somebody who knows about editing Wikipedia. You buy pizza, always a guaranteed draw, and you sit down with some reference books, and you either improve or you create entries on Wikipedia for the women in your field who are missing. So that's an example of doing public scholarship. Wikipedia, right, we all tell our students, hopefully you tell your students this, it's a good place to start, like any encyclopedia. It is not a good place to finish. But I mean, frankly, when I want to know something about an area, I'll go to Wikipedia, and I'll get a good overview quickly, right? So let's make that better. There are lots of people who start and end with Wikipedia. So it's free to add to. It has its quirks as a community, God knows, but that's one kind of public scholarship that we can all contribute to. And you can get your students to contribute to. On Wikipedia, you need to have sources. This may surprise you, but people will ding you and say, there are no citations for this. They should be modern sources. They should link to other things. Oh, look, there's that linking again. Right? So this can actually be a very interesting beginning scholarly endeavor for students to understand what it is that we do and why what you wrote, your opinion, isn't really what we want to read about on Wikipedia. There's one on Italian. I won't go through it given the time, but there was a really interesting project on Italian cinema, for example. So again, when you have the site, the page, you can click on that. There are transcription projects. So you have, let's say there are, again, Barbara's interested in manuscripts, things written by hand. Okay, I can put pictures of those up online, but if you want to search for some text in one of those, you can't find it because it's not, back to Tim Berners-Lee, it's not machine readable. So there are projects doing machine readable, converting, reading the manuscript, reading the handwriting, and typing up a machine readable form. So we'll see if the photo album transcription project kicks in. Lots of people are doing these. There we go. Let's see, now that's a nice looking web page, right? So you go through photo albums, and people write things in photo albums, right? You label everybody, or you say when and where it was. So this project is interested in getting those data out of the photo albums. That's a lot of work. But if you crowdsource, right, are people familiar with that? You can get help on those projects. So that's the idea behind these. And again, you can get, if you're working in an area where that's useful, you can get your students engaged with that. And then those things last forever, or at least as long as the project does. Finally, tagging things. Right? You've all tagged photos in photo, or you put hashtags in your Twitter. Same idea. Go through, why is this an interesting object? Metadata Games is it's a gaming platform where you make it like a game, people get points, you get rewarded, gamifying. Last one, for your students and maybe for yourself, along with your online activity, your online identity, keep track of your bibliography, right? I mean, some of us in the room are old enough when we first started using computers and wasn't that fun. It was a lot easier than those giant pieces of paper. Some of us may still keep things in paper. But Zotero is an online bibliography. You can share your bibliography with other people. You might have a project, and part of the project is creating a bibliography, so a digital history project. Put it on Zotero. Let other people see it. Share it so other people can contribute. Have your students do it. Your students writing a paper? Great, I want to see your bibliography. What do? You hand in a piece of paper, right, back in the day. Don't hand it in, put it on Zotero and let me see it. Then I know what's going on. Zooniverse is a place, if you don't know what you want to do, Zooniverse has lots of projects you can join in on. All right, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop. This is my project on ancient temples. I already showed you a little bit. But just to give you some idea of the ways you can interact, it's a spreadsheet. So here's a Google. And I can talk more about that if anybody asks. It's also a bunch of files, which you just saw. They live on GitHub and on my computer. It's a website. So people can interact in the way I want them to with it if they're not really into grabbing data. And it's a map. So back to Megan's original thing. And the map is actually quite useful, and I've done some lesson plans around it as well. And I'm done. Other random things we can talk about if you like. Thank you.